All right, we will get started. I know there's probably some people trickling in right now, but we'll get started with the event. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. We are so excited to be hosting Professor Shalanda Baker, the Deputy Director of Energy Justice at the Department of Energy. Before we begin, I'd like to express a deep gratitude to all those who helped put together today's event. With the support of NRDC, the Scheller Center, Temple Environmental Law Society, Professor Reiser, Professor Sinden, and Temple Law students, today was made possible. So thank you all so much. Today's event is the finale to our Environmental Justice Speaker Series, with our first event being aimed at addressing environmental justice within the Philadelphia community at the community level. Our second event addressed the Green New Deal at the state and local level. And now this event is addressing energy justice at the federal level. We have put together these events to promote a discussion regarding one of the biggest issues facing our planet, climate change. But in particular, we wanted to bring together lawyers, scholars, and activists to really discuss how we can create solutions that include marginalized communities who are oftentimes left out of the discussion. So today, we're going to begin with an introduction given by Professor Sinden, followed by the moderated portion of our event, and conclude with the question and answer segment conducted by Ilana Pacione and Carlos Donato. We expect today's event to be informative and lively and extremely relevant in light of recent climate catastrophes impacting energy infrastructure. So our goal today is to foster a diverse, considerate, and respectful discussion regarding the issues presented. Please be mindful that when posting in the chat, we do have organizers watching to make sure that our goals are upheld, to make sure that it's lively, but also just considerate and respectful. And with that being said, please address any questions during the portion of the moderation or any time throughout the rest of the event into the chat function, and we will do our best to get to every single question within the question and answer segment. So thank you again for attending, and I'll pass the mic over to Professor Amy Sinden to introduce Professor Baker.
Hey y'all, hi everybody. I'm so delighted to be here on this Friday evening for this really exciting event. The last, as Brittany said, in this what has really been a wonderful environmental justice speaker series this spring semester. Thank you to Brittany and all the students who, for Len and I, it has just been such a pleasure to watch you guys sort of pick up this ball and just run with it in directions that I don't even know if we could have imagined, but it really has been a really wonderful series of events this spring, and because of the energy and enthusiasm and creativity and competence and everything else that you guys have brought to this. And I also want to say that I bring greetings and welcome also from Dean Harris, who really wanted to be here to welcome everyone himself. But, everyone knows this is a busy time of the semester, and he's actually, as we speak, speaking himself as a panelist at some other Zoom conference. With that, I want to talk about the guest that we are so fortunate to have today, Professor Shalanda Baker. And what I'll say is, when we first started talking about these events and brainstorming about what we wanted to do, one of the first things Brittany said is, let's get Professor Shalanda Baker. And what I said was, I don't know, Brittany, I think we might be sort of shooting above our weight, or what's the expression, or it's a little out of our league, right? Because I knew that Professor Baker had already been a really, really sought after speaker just because of the recent publication of her book, Revolutionary Power, an Activist's Guide to the Energy Transition, which has been getting a lot of buzz, and she's been speaking about it all over the place. And then what happened in January or February, whenever it was, not very long ago, President Biden went and plucked her off the faculty of Northeastern to be his first ever Deputy Director for Energy Justice at the Department of Energy, which is just so exciting. But I knew that since that had just happened, she was going to be even busier. And I said, Brittany, you know, I'll introduce you, right? Because I'm kind of connected to her through the Center for Progressive Reform, this progressive think tank that I'm part of. And I'm proud to say that we were smart enough a couple of years ago to ask Professor Baker to join our ranks as a member scholar, and she in fact did that. So I said, I can make the introduction, but I just don't want you to get your hopes up. You know, she is going to be really busy. So that's what I did. And wouldn't you know it, Brittany somehow, I don't understand how, managed to convince Professor Baker to come join us here at Temple on this Friday evening, for which we are really, really grateful. I'll just say my students in my climate change seminar this semester had the pleasure of reading some big chunks out of her book just a couple of weeks ago when we did a unit on energy law. And I highly recommend it to anyone who hasn't yet had the chance to read it. I mean, it's a super cool book. And one of the coolest things about it is that Professor Baker didn't really write like a law professor. She weaves into this thing like elements of her own autobiography together with just incredibly clear and cogent explanations of some of the most complex and intricate areas of law and policy, right? I mean, energy law, for those who don't know, is no joke. Like, this is some stuff that can be really arcane and difficult to understand, and she somehow manages to make it crystal clear, and then also paints this incredibly inspiring vision of what this coming energy transition could look like if we get it right? If we do it in a way that's respectful to communities that have suffered historic injustice and so on. So let me tell you just a little bit about Professor Baker's background. As I mentioned, she is on leave from her position on the faculty at Northeastern Law School. She's been there several years. In 2018, she also co-founded the Initiative for Energy Justice, which is a group that supports the delivery of equity-centered energy policy research and technical assistance to policymakers and frontline communities across the country. Professor Baker also had like an entirely different career before she became a lawyer, and that was as an Air Force officer prior to her honorable discharge under Don't Ask, Don't Tell, subsequent to which she became a very vocal advocate for repeal of that policy. After her graduation from law school, she clerked on the Massachusetts Supreme Court. She worked at a private law firm doing corporate and project finance work, both in Boston and in Japan. She then was in Wisconsin. She was a William H. Hastie Fellow at the University of Wisconsin, where she worked with our very own Jonathan Lipson for a year or so, and where she earned her LLM. In 2016, she then got a Fulbright fellowship to spend a year in Mexico looking at energy reform issues, climate change, and indigenous rights. Professor Baker also spent some years prior to coming to Northeastern teaching on the faculty at the University of San Francisco School of Law, and also at the University of Hawaii, where she was the founding director of the Energy Justice Program. So as you can see, she has just a wealth of experience on which to draw, and we're really looking forward to hearing from her and delighted that she's here with us tonight. So with that, let me pass the, whatever we call it on Zoom, the microphone, the spotlight, over to Professor Baker. Thank you.
What an intro. Thank you so much, Professor Sinden. I love that. And I'm just so delighted to be here alongside you and Brittany, and I just look forward to this conversation.
Yes, we are so grateful that you were able to join us today. So there's a lot of questions because I definitely am so excited to pick your mind about energy justice and everything that you have experienced in your career. I think it's appropriate to kind of start from square one. In your book, you mentioned a little bit about how you grew up in an environmental justice community. You talked a lot about Port Arthur, Texas, and how much of an impact growing up in that space really kind of directed you to where you are now. Would you be able to talk a little bit more about that and what kind of led you to where you are?
Sure, sure. So thank you again, Brittany, for having me. I just want to acknowledge here on a Friday afternoon that it's a pleasure to be dialing in, and I'm dialing in today from Piscataway territory, which is a traditional territory of Native peoples here in Washington, D.C., what is now called Washington, D.C. So I want to acknowledge that. So I grew up in Austin, Texas, and my family was like many American families. It was a split household. My father's family was in a place called Port Arthur, Texas, and my mom raised my sister and me in Austin. And Port Arthur is really where I became aware of issues of discrimination and issues of environmental injustice. So Port Arthur is in the southern part of Texas. It's a couple hours outside of Houston. It's right on the border between, it's right on sort of the border of Texas and Louisiana. It's also the birthplace and the epicenter of the modern fossil fuel system. So we have some of the most dense oil and gas production facilities there, refineries, petrochemical facilities. It's called the Golden Triangle. And it's so called because when you look at that place on a satellite image at night, it just lights up. Some people call it the Golden Triangle as well because of the extractive industries that generate wealth in that community. But the wealth is not equitably spread, and the wealth is really going to those multinational companies in that region. And so I didn't grow up there necessarily, but I did visit as a kid, and my father's family has deep roots there. My dad, in fact, grew up in the Carver Terrace housing projects, which are what I'm sure many of your listeners and many of the people who come to these sessions know this term. It's a fence line community. And so they're right on the fence line of a refinery. In fact, the Texaco refinery, which is now the Motiva refinery, but one of the largest refineries in the world. And so people there are constantly breathing in toxins and fumes and frequently even asked to shelter in place because of violations of air quality standards that are routine in that area. And of course, there are lots of reasons why that's the case, but it's an ongoing problem and it's not a new one. It's been in place for a while. So I started to write about Port Arthur beginning in 2017. And so I'm a climate, energy, environmental scholar, and that fall of 2017 was the fall that we had all of these huge hurricanes. So Hurricane Maria, Irene, Harvey. And so when Harvey hit Houston, I was just deep into the news, reading everything I could find about, the hurricane, the impacts, electricity impacts, et cetera. And late one night, I was reading the New York Times and I scrolled through, the updates and saw a video from Facebook Live from a young man who's from Port Arthur, Texas. And he said, in the video, please help, the water's up to our knees, we need help, please help us, somebody please essentially rescue us. And that young man was actually my brother, which was, So as I mentioned, I grew up in a split home, and my father had other kids who were much younger than me. And I was shocked to find this young man, Shalanda Baker, with that video. And so at that point, I got really interested in Port Arthur, and I got really interested in the infrastructure that is there and the impacts that community has faced. And I immediately got to writing, and I wrote an article actually called Anti-Resilience, which is published in the Harvard Civil Rights, Civil Liberties Journal. And I was arguing that, when these major catastrophes strike, we shouldn't be focused on resilience. We should actually be thinking about the underlying conditions that make these communities vulnerable. Because if we think about resilience in a place like Port Arthur, we're cementing in place inequality. And so we shouldn't go straight to resilience as a public good, but we should be disruptive and thinking about other qualities, such as, remediating legacy harm and giving folks access to distributed energy and other resilience resources. So that was the beginning of my journey in terms of writing about Port Arthur, and it was an entry point into my book.
That's amazing. And I think a lot of it, you touched a little bit about, how these communities are oftentimes overburdened. You called it the Golden Triangle. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. We know very well that especially low income and minority populations are overburdened by energy production facilities and hazardous waste facilities. How does this happen? And can you just talk a little bit more about, what we're seeing now?
Sure. So how does it happen? The law sanctions it, right? It's not accidental. It's intentional. These are not neutral developments. A lot of times they come with obviously serious externalities, health impacts, and we have a system of law and policy and regulatory frameworks that allows for the siting of these types of facilities in those communities. And often it's a result of, folks not being able to engage in the regulatory process or the siting process, the community engagement process, or sometimes it's the case of, the developers and the state holding meetings, but really just checking a box and saying, yes, we did consultation, now we can actually move forward with the project. So this is baked into our system. I actually focus more on energy justice in my work, but the energy justice literature and scholarship really builds on the work of environmental justice scholars like Robert Bullard, who really was a founding member of the EJ, movement, I would say, and scholarly field. So his work has shown us that, there's environmental racism, there's racism kind of baked into our law. I mean, these are structurally unequal mechanisms that allow for this method of development, and sort of pulling the thread of inequity out of that. We know that our energy system also has structural racism baked into it, from the siting to the rate design and to other inequities that disproportionately fall on those same communities, and things that we don't often think about in the energy context.
Right. And I think that was really brought to light in recent events. I mean, if we think about Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico and we think about the Texas grid failure, we see how certain communities are disproportionately affected and impacted because they aren't given the necessary resources. They don't have the same type of access to energy that maybe people living or that are able to afford battery storage might. I'm kind of interested in hearing a little bit more about maybe we can talk first about Puerto Rico. And after Hurricane Maria, it definitely showed how extremely evident an energy infrastructure can debilitate an entire community, right? So what does a more resilient and updated energy system actually look like, especially in light of being cognizant of, the communities that are most impacted?
Oh, sure. So for those of you who don't know how the current energy system is designed, let me just give a quick overview. So we have a system of centralized generation, usually located away from a population center. Sometimes it's near a population center, but that power is generated in a facility, most likely a fossil fuel facility. And then the power is sent through transmission lines, high voltage transmission lines across miles and miles, hundreds of miles, and then going into population centers and reaching homes through distribution lines. And so it's multiple steps in the system, but this system of poles and wires and generation really worked for the first 100 years of the modern energy system. But in this climate emergency, those more centralized generation facilities and that complex network of wires and poles actually makes communities that are far away from a climate disaster vulnerable to the disasters that are happening, closer to the generation or through the transmission system. And so folks who are really interested in resilience think about distributed energy resources. And so even as recently as 5 years ago, the idea of a microgrid was something like, science fiction, and a microgrid is essentially, you know, having the ability to disconnect from the main grid and maintain your power system. Sometimes you have a battery that powers it, you know, a set of solar panels, along with a battery that allows critical infrastructure to stay online. That is moving out of the realm of science fiction and becoming a reality in many places, particularly with corporations who are realizing the vulnerability of the grid and have their own sort of critical infrastructure that they want to maintain. And so they're building resilience into their own systems. And I think when we turn to situations like Puerto Rico and Texas, we need to start thinking about resilience through the lens of who is least able to bounce back from these types of weather emergencies. And we know that a lot of people in Puerto Rico died tragically because of the hurricane, but many more died because they lacked access to power. And so, you know, folks lacked access to medical devices. Sometimes, and I've done a little research field work in Mexico, but also in Puerto Rico post Maria. And you know, a lot of folks are saying that neighbors, maybe one neighbor in a community had a battery or had a generator, and they all kind of went there to charge cell phones and that kind of thing. But for folks who rely on oxygen and other critical medical devices, life-saving devices, being without power, even for a short number of hours, can be devastating. And for those who are on a fixed income, so now I'm thinking about places like Texas, places like New York, where Hurricane Sandy hit, as well as California, where we have, you know, routine blackouts now as a feature of life in the 5th largest economy in the world, right? Can we just wrap our minds around that? So we have routine blackouts there. And for people who live there, who are low income, who are on a fixed income, they can't afford to replace medicines. They can't afford to replace foods. There are people who are not even on the radar in terms of medical vulnerability. And so the power company isn't even thinking about them and when the lights go out. So we have an energy system that isn't working for this moment. And, you know, as much as I write about utilities, especially investor-owned utilities, and sort of give them a bad name, they've gotten us this far, and now they need to let go and let a new system kind of take hold. And that's really the call for this moment.
And it's honestly so good to hear you say that, because I mean, we see how, you know, these solutions that utilities are coming up with, and public utility commissions are also coming up with, like moratoriums, for example, right? If we think about how the COVID pandemic has impacted people's ability to pay their utility prices, right? And, you know, we've given a moratorium as the solution, but in realization, people have to pay that back at the end of the period. So I guess, do you have, what's your opinion on that? And what's maybe a better solution?
Brittany, you're like reading my mind here. So it's been a whirlwind year. I mean, as Professor Sinden said, I started an organization about 2 years ago. Things were going great. We were off to the races. I was writing this book that related to race and energy and equity in the energy system. And then the pandemic hit. The pandemic hit a year ago, and I was just about to launch my summer research program, which had PhDs. It was interdisciplinary. It had law students. We had people from all over the country who were going to be on our team, and we had to pivot online. And the whole purpose of my organization, the Initiative for Energy Justice, was to work with communities and work with folks who were struggling to participate in the energy transition, either because they lacked access to research, regulatory models, et cetera. And so we were just about to launch this and our summer program online, and a community organization in Boston reached out to me and said, "We'd love your technical assistance." And I said, "Okay, well, what are your issues? What are you grappling with?" And regulatory reform was a big part of one pillar of our research. And they said, "We love the regulatory reform work, but we want to know what the utilities are going to do." And I said, "What do you mean, what are they going to do?" And she said, "Right now with this pandemic," and again, it was about April, May. And that time was when we saw all of these different moratoria on utility disconnections that you're talking about, right? So governors would issue executive orders saying no shutoffs, no disconnections at all utilities, sometimes only one of the utilities, but in general, there were blanket moratoria on internet, water, gas, and electric. And we were also seeing regulatory commissions. So the regulators for utilities say you can't disconnect, but that wasn't uniform. It was ad hoc, it was patchwork. And so my team began to track those policies that were unfolding around the country. And we were sort of seeing that this was a patchwork quilt. And there were, at the same time, a lot of researchers in the energy justice space were beginning to look at this. And there were researchers in Indiana at Indiana University, Sonia Carley and David Koninsky, who started to do surveys and panels. They decided to do 3 waves of surveys to see what was happening on the ground with people getting disconnected or getting notices. And what they found in their survey was that even when there was a policy in place prohibiting disconnections, people were still getting notices about it. And so we know what that moment was a year ago, right? We were all going in, people were losing their jobs, having the rug pulled out from under them, struggling to pay their bills, had this moratorium in place, but we're still getting notices from a utility that was saying you have to pay. And so, and again, as you mentioned, the arrearages were accruing. So they found out that people were still getting notices. They found out that people were still getting disconnected. And they found out that those disconnections and notices were disproportionately falling on people of color, right? And so, again, this is the race problem that we have within the energy system. And so what do I think about all of this? Well, I think the government has a role to play. And, there was a study that was issued back in January by the National Bureau of Economic Research and Duke University that showed that if we had a federal policy, a uniform policy on utility disconnections in the summer and in the fall, which we did not, we could have averted 15% of COVID deaths. And we already know that those deaths have disproportionately fallen in communities of color. So that means we could have saved Black and brown lives, right? And so the energy system is implicated in this pandemic, and a lot of the issues with disconnections, the issues with payment, go back to the structure and design of our system, where we have a rate design that means that we are, with a very blunt instrument, charging everyone the same amount of overall percentage, the same rate for electricity, when some low-income households are left paying upwards of 15-20% just to meet energy needs of their overall income, just to meet energy needs. So we need a more nuanced approach to rate design, and I think the federal government could play a role in helping to create some consistency. At the very least, we need more transparency around disconnections. I'll end with saying that the last thing my research team, so not only were we tracking these policies, but the next research question was, okay, well, who's getting disconnected? We know disconnections are happening. And so I had my team go into regulatory dockets and really search for disconnection data, but there's no uniform method of reporting. A lot of regulatory commissions don't require reporting of disconnections. And when utilities do report disconnections, they report disconnections in an aggregate fashion. So you can't even tell which types of communities are being more impacted by disconnection policies. And so we've got a problem. We've got a data problem. We've got a law problem. And so this is energy justice.
Yeah, and I think that's so timely. I mean, we actually, our first event featured 2 attorneys from Community Legal Services of Philadelphia who talked about their work in making sure that they could postpone or help, residents who were dealing with shutoffs. I mean, I think of a statistic I was given that I think it's over $40 billion is owed to utility providers right now. That amount is huge. It's I can't even imagine how are they going to get that money back if these people in the first place can't even afford these high rates that they're being charged?
Right. Well, the utilities are in line to get some assistance, right, from the federal government to write off that debt. And so that's utility debt as well, right? It's both consumer debt and on the back end, it's utility debt. And the question is, when they receive those federal funds, will they also forgive the debt? Or will they continue to go after, people who owe it, which is a devastating thing to sort of look at a $3,000, utility bill, you're making $10 an hour. I mean, what are you going to do with that? And it's just, again, this is, Brittany, you've actually hit the nail on the head. This is one of my kind of like issues, this drives me insane thinking about the deep injustice that families are facing. And you asked about my father, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention my mother. And I talk about her struggles in the book. So I grew up in a household that was headed up by a single mom. And that meant that, we were juggling bills all the time. And I didn't get it. I mean, I was a kid, but I did see her struggle with when to pay bills, how to pay bills. And, that meant that we were in a household that was energy insecure. So energy insecurity is an abstract concept, but let me make it very clear. It means that people are doing things like using ovens to warm their homes. That is extraordinarily dangerous. It means that families are using things like open flames to get warm. It means that, like my family, people are boiling water on the stovetop to put water into baths. And so these are the types of coping strategies that are happening in America. And that's in low-income families that actually have electricity. There are so many Native American households and Black families in the South that don't have any electricity at all. And so this is the challenge of our moment, and this is the challenge of our generation.
I agree. Similar to you, it also just makes me so mad. I think, it kind of seems like, as we talk about this, it almost seems like a David and Goliath situation, right? We have an individual, a homeowner that can't afford to pay their utility bill. They go up to the big utility provider who has millions of dollars, services thousands of people within their community. And maybe let's say that they are interested in getting off the server and doing maybe a community energy system or community cooperative, or even like a public power provider, right? Or maybe looking into that. Could you talk a little bit more about these methods of maybe changing the system and whether or not they're feasible to communities that might not have the resources like money or legal costs?
Sure. Well, so this is why I wrote the book. I mean, my hope really is that it's a book that my mom, my aunt, like people that don't have any connection to, law and policy research or academia can pick up and sort of thumb through and flag and all of the things, because I try to lay out ways in which people can engage in the energy system, or at the very least, which debates they should be paying attention to. And, that assumes that people have capacity to get involved. What I would say in terms of the David and Goliath question is that people are organizing like never before, right? And there is such a need to tap into these coalitions of people who are doing work at regulatory commissions that are engaged in the sort of tough work of moving the needle on equity in the regulatory commission, in these proceedings. I mean, all the law students out there, I'm raising a flag here to say, the Public Utilities Commission is a great place to start your legal career. You're going to learn a lot about law. You're going to learn a lot about regulatory policy, and it is dense and complex. But once you get it, you get it. And so, it is David and Goliath, but we need more resources going into organizations that are participating in the policymaking process. And we can do that through law. And one mechanism I talk about in the book is through intervener funding, which gives people, gives organizations and individuals support to participate, because who has time, right? Like what family who has, a house full of kids and 2 or 3 jobs has time to get involved in regulatory proceedings? And it should be meaningful, support. One organization in California, the Utility Reform Network, which is TURN for short, gets a lot of its funding from intervener funding in California. And so their whole organization, their staff of attorneys, is funded through this mechanism. And so I think other states need to be looking at that so that it's less of a David and Goliath, because not only is it David and Goliath, with respect to the ratepayer and the utility, it's David and Goliath with respect to the types of stakeholders who are at the table, because we often have these utilities who are holding all the information. There's an information asymmetry, and they're not sharing it with the other stakeholders. And so we need more academics at the table discerning that data, and we also need advocates that are well funded to be able to spend time in those proceedings. But this is just the beginning, Brittany. This is time for coalition building. This is time for partnerships. This is the moment to be engaged because we are reshaping the energy system right now. And again, that's why I wrote the book.
I love that. And I think it'd be amiss for me to not talk about how, you talk so much about justice first, the justice first policy in your book. And I love it because it's centering equity in the middle of the fight of climate change. And, I think it's important too to discuss like how this might intersect with all the things going on right now. I mean, there's been, George Floyd's trial is being broadcast right now, and just, the attacks on Asian Americans. And it's so interesting to see like these, intersections between all these different areas. I know in a recent article you talked briefly about that. Would you be able to share your thoughts on that?
Oh, sure. I think, and maybe the op-ed that I wrote, I'm not sure, this summer. Well, so for me, there's no way to disentangle our broader reckoning with structural racism with, we can't disentangle that struggle from our struggle on climate. The climate crisis is going to impact and is already impacting the most marginalized people in our society the most, right? So again, all the things I talked about in terms of people bouncing back, they're not able to bounce back. They don't have the resources, and it's not their own fault that they don't have the resources. They don't have the resources because of structural inequality and the ways in which our society has been designed. And so we have to think about this reckoning with racial inequality, this pandemic, on top of that, economic injustices that are now coming even more and more to the surface. We have to think about all those things together in connection with this climate crisis, because the climate crisis is connected to all of those things and the problems that those issues have exposed. I would say that, when people tell me we shouldn't be thinking about equity or centering equity in this transition, I say that we can't avoid it. And we can't sort of think about designing an energy system without thinking about the most vulnerable. It's immoral to do so, but it would also mean that we're going to be facing costs down the road. I mean, think about Texas, for example. A lot of folks there were underinsured or uninsured, and they're seeking aid from the federal government to fix their homes, right, and to fix their pipes. So this is a cost that could have been avoided by a more just energy system. And so, one that allowed for that resilience that we talked about, and, batteries, or prioritize low-income households in keeping their lights on. When a lot of us know that the power's going out, or when there's going to be a big storm, if we have money, you're going to go to a hotel, you're going to hit the road. But for lower income folks, they're stuck. And so we need a power system that responds to the inevitable vulnerability that those folks are going to face. So the climate crisis must center them. And I think folks are coming around. I critique a lot of the mainstream environmental movement in my book because they have not been good stewards and good partners, stewards of, of the environment for people of color. They have not been good partners with people of color in this movement. But now is the time to sort of let bygones be bygones in a sense, but they have to get on board, and we have to be in partnership together, because the urgency of this moment can't be overstated.
Right. And I feel like one of the things that we constantly have to do, especially in the climate change world, is to debunk these myths that are kind of floating around when people say that centering equity at the forefront of the climate change fight is unrealistic given the short-term timeline that remains to act on climate change. How would you debunk that myth that is floating around there in the ethos?
Yeah, I mean, again, our fates are intertwined. Our fates are linked. The climate crisis is a crisis of inequality. Again, we know that we're all in this together in a sense, but there are folks who are going to be hit really hard in this crisis. And so we need a system of government. We need a system of sort of support that allows for folks to weather the inevitable storms that are coming down the pipeline. I mean, it can't be overstated, and it's all abstract until it comes to your own community. And, we're entering hurricane season pretty soon, and we've already gotten word that this is going to be a bad hurricane season. And so for people in places like the one where my dad and my brothers grew up, they're low-income people, low-income Black and Latinx folks. And so they're not able to just say, oh, okay, well, we'll harden our homes or we'll prepare in some way. I mean, in many ways, they need assistance and they need a system that actually is going to work for them. And it will make us all better in the end. I mean, we're taking care of the most vulnerable folks. It makes us all stronger. They can contribute to the economy. And again, this is not the first argument I would make, but like for folks who need some convincing that taking care of people who've been sort of at the bottom of the barrel for 4 centuries, is a good thing to do. I would say that today, caring for our most vulnerable folks in this climate emergency is going to help the country.
I think that's honestly, you couldn't have said it perfect, more perfect. I think also too, we're seeing the federal government pushing, addressing some of these issues. I mean, I took a look at Biden's infrastructure plan the other day, and I saw, how he's really trying to promote electric cars, updating the electric grid and plugging up wellheads. I guess, what other things can we kind of see in that infrastructure bill that will address some of these issues that you've raised thus far?
Yeah, I mean, so I know I was introduced as a professor, which is great because I'm speaking here in my personal capacity, not as the new Deputy Director for Energy Justice, but I'm excited in my personal capacity about what's going on in the federal government. The infrastructure kind of white paper, working draft that was put out last week is incredibly exciting. This is a transformative moment. I like to think about it as reconstruction. And, I think because we're so in this horrible moment where things are falling apart all around us that we don't see just how badly they've fallen apart, but things have fallen apart. And we have to build this country, right? We have to recreate the fabric of our country in so many different ways. And I think the infrastructure package really speaks to the need to build wealth in certain communities. I mean, there's some great things about the transportation sector. They're talking about reuniting communities that have been divided by racist policies that the federal government facilitated, right? There's a note in there about acceleration of businesses involved in this transition and really making sure that investments go to traditionally underserved communities and disadvantaged communities. And, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the Justice 40 initiative, which is the president's commitment to 40% of the overall benefits of certain investments to frontline disadvantaged communities. And in my other hat, I'm running and leading that initiative at DOE, which is an incredible honor. So yeah, there's hope. I think this president, unlike any other, is making equity a central feature of his work, and it's a part of his legacy, right? And it's so funny. I mean, when I was asked to do my role in the administration, I was like, you know what I've written, right? Like, who I am. And I've not been shy about my commitments to racial equity, my commitments to social justice. And they're like, yes, we actually want you to do that. And so to me, that speaks to the real commitment that this government is making. And the fact that I can say structural racism openly and not, be seen as someone who's completely off base. I mean, our own president says that on a daily basis. So it's a new day. It's a reconstruction moment, I would say.
It is absolutely a new day. And I think one thing that made me so excited was to see President Biden's statement on environmental justice. And, it brought up some new things and considerations for me as I, considered what environmental justice has meant for the federal government. Just thinking of Executive Order 12898 under President Clinton, where environmental justice was kind of introduced as a consideration in agency decisions, right, for major projects and proposals. I wonder if you foresee this kind of taking more of a spotlight as we continue forward? And do you foresee any possibility of kind of expanding this? I mean, I know that independent agencies aren't included in that executive order. And I guess kind of, do you see that this is going to be a priority for this administration?
Well, I mean, I think the president has been pretty clear that the commitment to environmental justice will be a cross-cutting commitment across every single agency in government. And in fact, I mean, we can see by from his appointments that folks are committed and that they have the commitments. There was also in Executive Order 14008, which is the order that establishes the Justice 40 initiative. There is also the requirement that the White House establish an environmental justice advisory council, as well as an intergovernmental advisory council intergovernmental council on EJ, on environmental justice. So those are real commitments. There's never been a White House level advisory council solely committed to environmental justice issues, never. And the folks who were just announced last Tuesday, I think, to be on that are leaders in the movement from all over the country, from indigenous nations, from, like really the real deal. And, a lot of folks in the movement have been applauding the choices. And the person who's leading all of this is at the Council on Environmental Quality, and that's Cecilia Martinez. And she comes straight from the movement. It's Dr. Cecilia Martinez, who left academia to become an activist and then was handpicked by the president to lead his EJ work. So I think it's real.
A lot of powerful people on that administration, people that are being introduced. I love it. And I guess just because this is a huge topic of conversation for so many climate activists right now, the Green New Deal. I'm wondering, there's so many different things going on about, why it's good, why it's bad, but, how do your proposals align with the Green New Deal, and what would you like to see prioritized with that?
Yeah, so in the book, I situate the key claims and the framing of my work in the Green New Deal in a moment where we are calling for deep social equity across all of our investments. I mean, again, folks have been saying this in different ways, and now we have it kind of at the White House where it's being said in a different way. But, the Green New Deal, the conceit of it was really to think of the climate moment as a moment of reckoning with socioeconomic inequality, and that we needed to think about jobs. We needed to think about job creation in this transition. We needed to think about sort of minimum standards of decency and life, right? And the Green New Deal was also about vulnerability, and it was broad. It was far-reaching in terms of its vision. And remember, it was really just a resolution. It was never legislation, but it really, I think, aligned a lot of folks, or got a lot of folks excited, and people lined up behind it, both in terms of critique and in terms of pushing it further. And so my work and my own vision is a part of that broader call to make sure that our transition includes and incorporates issues of socioeconomic justice, because it has to be about wealth creation. If we were able to solve the climate crisis, meaning that is to say avert catastrophic climate change, but without lifting people out of poverty and without creating jobs in environmental justice communities, then and without making sure that people had access to reliable, clean power across the board, we will fail, right? We can't avert. Well, I don't think we can actually succeed in averting catastrophic climate change without those other components. But I just think this is a tremendous opportunity to ensure that as we do all of this investing in our new energy system, we are investing as well in the communities that have been so harmed by the old system. It really is a debt owed to those folks. And again, it's a moral obligation.
Right. And I you know, I realize we're coming close to our time for the moderated segment. I have two more questions, if you wouldn't mind asking them. You know, you talked a little bit about, you know, owing a debt to these populations that have been overburdened. How can we address and rectify these harms that certain communities have felt by carrying the burden of energy production?
Sure. So I'll talk a little bit about outcomes, and then I'll get to the mechanism. So I think in terms of outcomes, we need to reduce energy burden in low-income communities and communities of color. And by energy burden, I mean the overall amount that people are paying to meet energy needs. We know, and I think I mentioned this before, that certain folks are paying $1 in $5, $1 in $4 that come into the household just for electricity. And again, let me remind you that that's to subsidize a system that is killing them, right? Because those are also the folks who are likely living in the shadows of fossil fuel generation. So we have to reduce energy burden and make energy more affordable for those folks. We also need to make sure that people have access to clean energy. And so we know that the solar transition has happened in a racially stratified manner. So white households are more likely to have solar, and brown and black households, majority POC or BIPOC census tracts don't have the same access. And this is even when you think about home ownership, and even when you think about income. Controlling for those things, you still don't have the same density of solar penetration in those communities. And so we've got to solve that problem. And the outcome, I think, is really closing the gap and making sure that those folks have access. And it's not just about having access to clean energy, it's about the economic benefits that come with that access. Folks who have rooftop solar are able to lower their utility bills. So that drives the energy burden piece as well. And so those are two outcomes that I would like to see. And I think the pathway there is absolutely through government intervention. It is also about getting utilities to rethink their business model. And we got to do that through regulatory interventions, as well as having more types of players in the energy space. So having, you know, the community choice aggregation and other types of players who are in the energy marketplace that can create opportunities for folks to have access to clean energy and cheaper, cleaner energy. So those are two outcomes and a couple of pathways, but there are many pathways to get there.
Absolutely. And one thing that stuck with me in particular is a quote from your book that said, the struggle for energy justice is nothing less than freedom. And that really, you know, I highlighted it, I made sure I wrote it down. And, you know, it made me, that took some reflection time for me. And I wonder, you know, we can kind of make up the system of, if there were two things that you could do tomorrow to start the perfect energy system for you, what would those two things be?
Wow, that's such a hard question, Brittany. Two things I would do tomorrow to make the energy system more free. Is that the question?
Yeah.
I mean, or go ahead. What was?
Just to, you know, make a perfect energy system, to at least start to get on that path.
I know. Well, I think first we would change the business model for investor-owned utilities. The drive for shareholder profit is, you know, one that cuts against the public interest. And so we saw that in California, and we see it again and again, even in this pandemic. So we've got to change the business model in service of social justice and socially beneficial outcomes. I think the second intervention would be making sure that everyone has access to local resilient power. And so local, it's sited in your community, and it's resilient, meaning you have backup power. So you have a battery or you have storage. And so those are two interventions. One is a very sort of tactical regulatory policy intervention, and one is, you know, about the material experience of folks on the ground. It's a great question.
Well, thank you so much for, you know, educating us and inspiring us with all your answers. We have been getting so many questions in the chat box. So I'm actually gonna hand the mic over to Carlos and Alana to briefly introduce themselves and to start asking you those questions. Thank you again so much. And Alana, Carlos, feel free to turn your video on and we'll get started with the questions.
Hello, everyone. I just want to first say thank you all for tuning in to this very important event. Thank you, Professor Baker, for taking the time out. My name is Alana Piccioni, and I'm a 1L here at Temple Law, and am part of Latin American Law Student Association and Temple Environmental Law Group. And I'm super excited to be here and to be able to speak with Professor Baker and ask her some questions from the audience. So I'd ask now if anyone has any questions to use the Q&A function.
And hi guys, my name is Carlos Donato. I'm also in LALSA with Alana, and I'll be helping out with the questions.
So the first one we can start out with is this that we got from the chat from Tyler. Can Congress or the DOE or any relevant agency attach a condition precedent to the utility bailout that they must forgive the consumer debt to get the relief money?
Well, that is such an interesting question, and one that many advocates have actually fought for and are fighting for. So I don't believe that made it into the last the American Recovery Act, but I think it's something that people will continue to fight for. So I came from the transactional law world, and I love the language that was in the question, condition precedent, which really kind of reflects the contractual approach. And to double down on the idea of a contract, I mean, utilities have a sacred responsibility to provide electricity, and they're in contract. They're in a contractual relationship with the American people, and they absolutely need to be good stewards of that relationship. And so a lot of advocates out there would say that there need to be multiple conditions on utilities taking money, particularly if they're not going to forgive the debt or only forgive a portion of the debt for folks on the ground. I should also just say here that there are other dynamics within the utility debt piece and within the arrearage piece. So we also know that money is going into the LIHEAP program, which is the Low Income Heating and Assistance Program. And that's essentially money in the pockets of folks coming from Health and Human Services, the Department of Health and Human Services. And many people access LIHEAP, as it's called, benefits every year for both heating, and now I think it's moving also into AC and other things because people are having trouble all year paying for bills. But we also need to think about that program and how it's, whether or not it's offering the structural benefits that we need. There's a structural problem here in terms of how much people are paying for electricity. And, again, the American people are paying to subsidize this system.
Well, thank you so much for that. And thank you, Tyler, for sending that question in. Carlos, do you have the next?
Yeah, the next question is from Nilay. It says, you mentioned that we need to incentivize utility companies to rethink their business models. Can you describe what's currently wrong with utilities companies' business model, and what changes do we need to see?
Sure. So an example that just always rises to the top of my mind is California. So Pacific Gas and Electric is one of the largest utilities in the country, and it's a large investor-owned utility, which is to say that it's owned by shareholders, and so shareholders rely on a certain profit, a certain return every year from the utility. And so utilities are essentially incentivized to maximize shareholder value. They're also incentivized to invest in big infrastructure, large projects that are not as resilient in the climate change era. And that's their incentive, because the more big infrastructure they can invest in, the higher their own return on investment is. And so there's just a perverse system in terms of the returns that are flowing out of the utility. And so in the California context, this was particularly devastating because PG&E actually is in charge of so much infrastructure, the transmission lines, the power lines, and poles that are way in sort of the backcountry of California. And the utility has a duty to maintain its own infrastructure, but it consciously made the decision not to maintain its infrastructure because it was going to be too expensive to do so. And that failure to maintain its own infrastructure, to cut, grass and tree branches and that sort of thing again and again, led to some of the most devastating wildfires in California history, which actually killed people. And so this was, extreme negligence on the part of the utility. And this was a choice that it made in order to save money. And so that, again, that's what I mean by the utility business model. It's not really incentivized to perform in all the ways we want it to perform. And so there are some regulatory alternatives. There's performance-based regulation, which is a complex system, but essentially through performance-based regulation, we pay the utility for hitting certain incentives. And but those are all designed in the regulatory process, which is why I'm sort of beating this drum to say community organizations need to get involved in these types of proceedings, because this is where the rubber hits the road.
Right. I totally see that. And, regarding local backups for energy, I've heard a lot about the idea of microgrids or smart grids. This is coming from the audience. What thoughts do you have on microgrids, and what incentives are in place, or would you recommend to get energy production companies to make the switch from singular production to a microgrid-based power grid?
Sure. I love these questions. So let's see, with microgrids, there are two types of challenges. One is a technical challenge, and making a grid that it can be, you wouldn't have to create a grid, but using the existing poles and wires and allowing that sort of set of poles and wires to disconnect from the grid as needed and connect to each other to keep that sort of set of assets or infrastructure powered. So that's a technical challenge. And there are people who are experts at that, right? They do feasibility studies on how to create microgrids. In places like Sub-Saharan Africa, where there is no infrastructure, creating a microgrid is much easier. And in fact, island nations and communities that have microgrids, I mean, this is, the islands can be so small that you're relying on, one limited source to power the entire community. So in the United States, though, there's a technical challenge in making those real, but we need to invest in that, right? We need to figure it out. We have the technology to make it happen. There are also regulatory challenges. So in some communities, you're not able to share energy in that way. And this is a problem that we can try to overcome through law and regulatory intervention. So it's both the technical and law and policy kind of challenge that those are two sets of challenges that need to be overcome. Oh, and how do we incentivize folks to do it? I mean, I think, governments are beginning to become aware that they can't just have people without power, which means that folks also don't have water for weeks and weeks on end. I mean, again, the stuff that happened in Texas, again, it should blow your mind. The stuff that happened in Mississippi, it should blow your mind. Because Mississippi has a lot of poor Black people, I'm not sure that it got the attention that it should have. You better believe if that happened in, Manhattan or, Boulder, Colorado, people were sitting without power for weeks on end and without water, we would be hearing about it. And so I think governments are starting to see that everyone is vulnerable in this climate emergency, and it's in large part due to the ways in which we design our energy system. And so we need to create government incentives to allow developers to engage in this type of experimentation and design and create the types of resilient power that we need.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Well, on the topic of incentivizing, we also got a question from Andy Metzger. It says, is there a way to incentivize people to reduce peak load power usage that would not result in the financial benefits being concentrated in those who can already afford to thoughtfully structure their power usage?
Yeah. So this is a question, I think there's someone who's an energy expert asked that question. So we have time of use, tariffs that are out there, which essentially incentivizes people to use less power when we need more, when we need to lower the peak of the grid, or I'm sorry, not of the grid, peak load. And so by structuring the rates in such a way that people can choose to not use power during certain times of the day, it helps to stabilize the grid. So again, if you're getting an incentive to not use power at a certain time, and it's more expensive to use power during that peak time. That's the bottom line. So these are time of use tariffs. I'd say the ways in which that has been designed, as far as I know, and I haven't done a deep dive on time of use rates, et cetera, does privilege the folks who have the most flexibility in their system. It's absolutely right. I haven't thought about it enough to sort of have a solution, but I think that solution was really designed to mitigate load impacts, to sort of prevent the use of peaker plants and those sorts of things, which are great outcomes. But I think we absolutely have to think about the distributive impacts of those sorts of regulatory interventions. I'm not bullish on time of use. I think it's an interesting model. But again, we have to just think through all of those things that you raised in your question. So it's a great question that I don't have the answer yet to that one.
Thank you. And from Benjamin Whitney, he said that in addition to energy resilience and access, like we've been talking about, policymakers also need to focus on adaptability. So how should we think about setting up infrastructure while also thinking about how certain parts of the country, like Miami, may be underwater within the next 100 years?
So this is why we need always interdisciplinary teams working on these issues. We need planners who are pulling in the right folks to kind of think through the matrix of risk that certain communities are facing. I think, so one of the things, I know I keep going back to Texas, but I think it's such a really great case study. So one of the things that came out of the last, the emergency that state faced was this idea of hardening infrastructure. And so I think we need to really weigh carefully the costs and benefits of hardening existing infrastructure versus creating new, more resilient infrastructure. And so, for example, in Miami, if you're going to build new infrastructure, you need to make sure, or if you're going to harden infrastructure in a city that is flooding even in the daytime in sunlight, you have to do that cost benefit analysis to understand whether you should instead be building other infrastructure that really is more resilient and it's away from those zones. So we need interdisciplinary teams to do the entire analysis. We also need to do cost benefit analysis and understand the benefits of hardening versus the benefits of new stuff. And always, 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 we need to be thinking about equity and cost in that calculus.
Thank you. The next question we have here says, you mentioned that our current system of planning and regulating the energy system creates a lot of information asymmetrics. Can you imagine any different methods of planning or regulation that would be easier for communities to participate in and that would facilitate energy justice?
Sure. So FERC is actually, and this will be interesting for Brittany, maybe FERC is developing an Office of Public Participation, which is designed to sort of break down a lot of the barriers that the public has in accessing information. I think we need to do a couple things. So utilities have all of the data, and often they're loath to release it due to so-called privacy concerns. And there's a lot of debate about whether or not that's always the case. But of course, there's proprietary meter-specific data that they should not release. But utilities hold all of the information, creating that information asymmetry. On the other hand, we have regulatory commissions that are notoriously underfunded. And so we have staff that are trying to read through all of the material that the utilities are providing. And so what they end up doing is relying a lot on the word of the utility with respect to the data. So we need to build those staffs, I think, we need to build the capacity of commissioners and their teams to be able to review the data. There's also an office of a public advocate or consumer advocate, usually in every state, where sometimes it sits in the AG's office, but their sole role is to be a watchdog with respect to the utility sector. And so those offices also tend to be underfunded. And so we need to fund the entities that are charged with keeping an eye on this stuff and managing the data. The other thing I would say is, again, I always go back to this. I think the people have so much power, and if we are building teams and cadres of folks who can get into the weeds on this, we're gonna help communities. But if we're just relying on utilities to kind of hold all the power, hold all the information without sharing it, we're gonna run into trouble continually. We already have.
Well, I mean, we have a lot of questions coming in. A lot of people want to run some things by you, but unfortunately, we've run out of time. So we got to wrap this up. And I just want to make some closing remarks on this. So we're closing out our 3-part environmental justice speaker series, and we were so thankful to have had Professor Shalanda Baker participate in our finale. The effort to host events like these is in large part due to the intensity of the climate crisis issue, how minority and low-income individuals are being disproportionately impacted, and our desire to make positive change as we construct equitable solutions. We also hope that by hosting these well-attended events, that we can help our Philadelphia communities address these issues by engaging in pro bono legal and community service activities. In addition, we hope that more opportunities for engaging in these conversations and educating ourselves and our community will be hosted by Temple Law and other schools in the surrounding areas. Thank you everyone for coming, and please follow Temple Environmental Law Society on Facebook and Instagram for updates on future events. And that's it. Thanks, guys. Thank you so much for coming, Professor Shalanda Baker. It was a good time. Like I could, as a 1L, I learned a lot.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. This was a lot of fun. And thank you, Brittany. Thank you, Professor Sinden, for having me be a part of this. I always love students. And so you pulled on my heartstrings, Brittany, when you emailed me, even though I was completely drowning. I wouldn't do it any other way. So thank you very much for allowing me to be here tonight. Have a great weekend, everybody.